I have been valet to Sebastian Ridley, Duke of Marchbanks, for near 20 years, and in all that time I never once saw him permit a stranger inside his carriage, let alone marry one he had known scarcely a day. The county called him the guarded Duke, and they were not wrong to. He kept his coach locked at every posting stop, his door bolted at every inn, and his heart, so far as I could tell, bolted tighter than either. Then, on a black February night on the Ashcott Road, a young woman flung herself into that carriage uninvited, soaked to the elbows with sleet, and by the following autumn he had married her in front of half the county. I was on the box that night, which is how I come to know the whole of it, start to finish, better than either of them ever admitted to anyone else. We had gone to Ashcott Hall that evening only because old Lord Ashcott had all but commanded it. The Duke did not care for assemblies, and Lord Ashcott had spent a decade trying without success to draw him into county society. The Duke stood by the punch table for exactly 40 minutes, spoke to no one beyond his host, and had called for the carriage before the second set had properly begun, which I confess did not surprise me in the least. He had told me once, on a similarly dull evening, that he attended these things purely to satisfy his neighbors that he had not, in fact, died quietly at Marchbanks and been buried without anyone noticing. What neither of us knew, waiting there at the foot of the drive while the horses stamped in the cold, was that in the side garden behind the orangery, a Mr. Edgar Coates had just that moment cornered Miss Isabel Hartley against a stone urn, and was pressing, for the 4th time that season, a proposal she had already declined 3 times in 3 different drawing rooms. "You are being unreasonable, Miss Hartley," he told her by her own later account, "and I think you know it. A curate's daughter with no fortune and a companion's wages cannot afford to be so very particular." He had not raised his voice. He had simply stood close enough and spoken with enough calm certainty that she understood refusing a 5th time might not be permitted to end the conversation. She excused herself, walked as steadily as she could manage to the front drive, saw a carriage waiting with its door not quite latched, and did not stop to check whose crest was painted on the panel before she climbed inside. We were 3/4 down the drive, sleet turning fast to proper snow, when the near door was wrenched open and she climbed bodily into the moving carriage, breathless, her cloak half off one shoulder, and said, in a voice pitched for someone she plainly believed to be her aunt's coachman, "Drive on, Barnes, quickly before he finds us." She realized her error the moment the interior lamp caught the Duke's face. I have never in 20 years heard a silence quite like the one that followed. She sat frozen on the seat opposite him, one hand still on the door strap, and he regarded her with the particular stillness he reserved for men who had cheated him at cards, and I fully expected him to have the carriage stopped, and the young lady set down in the snow with what courtesy the circumstances allowed. "I beg your pardon," she said instead, faintly, "I have got into the wrong carriage." "You have," the Duke agreed. "I shall get out." "You will do no such thing," he said. "We are moving, and it is slating, and I have no intention of being the man who let a lady break her neck climbing out of a carriage in the dark because she was too proud to sit still for a mile." He rapped the roof for me to keep on. "Where is your aunt's carriage, and why were you climbing into the wrong one at speed?" She was, it emerged over the first slow mile, Miss Isabel Hartley, a curate's daughter serving as companion to her aunt, Mrs. Coates of Fenning Grange, and she had been climbing into the wrong carriage at speed because Mr. Edgar Coates, no relation to her aunt, merely an unfortunate coincidence of surnames, she was careful to specify, had cornered her by the orangery and pressed a proposal upon her with such vigor and so little regard for her repeated refusals that she had concluded flight was the more dignified course. "He is not a wicked man," she said, with the fairness of someone determined to be fair even to a man who had frightened her badly. "He is merely persuaded that no woman with 400 a year and no better offers has any business refusing him twice." "And has he made you 2 offers or 200? the Duke asked. "4, said Miss Hartley, "this season alone," and something in the Duke's face, I saw it from my seat, glancing back through the little window, went very carefully blank in the particular way of a man deciding not to say something he has already half decided to do. They talked in the mile that followed of ordinary things, her father's small living at Fenning, 3 years dead now and sorely missed, the school she had once hoped to open for the parish girls before her father's debts made hoping of that kind impossible, the particular indignity of being a poor relation in a rich house, welcome at every dinner and consulted on nothing. The Duke, who I had never once heard volunteer a personal opinion to a stranger in 20 years of service, found himself telling her, unprompted, that he had wanted at 19 to study natural philosophy at Edinburgh, and had instead inherited a dukedom at 21 and never once in the years since been asked what he might have chosen instead. "Then I am asking," said Miss Hartley, "what would you have chosen?" "I have honestly no notion," he admitted, sounding, for the first time in my long acquaintance with him, faintly startled by his own answer. "No one has asked me that in 15 years. I shall have to think on it." The snow, which had been merely inconvenient at the start of the drive, had become a proper blizzard by the time we reached the crossroads, and I made the decision myself, without waiting to be asked, to turn the horses toward the Plough and Star rather than risk the low bridge at Cammer Beck in the dark. It was the right decision. It was also, as it happened, an extremely inconvenient one, because the Plough and Star had exactly one room left to let that night, every other traveler on the Ashcott Road having had the same idea about the bridge that I had. The innkeeper, a Mrs. Aldous who ran that house with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had buried 2 husbands and outlasted a war, looked at the 2 of them standing dripping in her hall, a duke in a caped greatcoat and a young woman in a torn cloak, arriving together at midnight in a snowstorm with no chaperone visible, and drew her own entirely reasonable conclusions. "The Wren room's the only one left, Your Grace, and Your Grace's lady is welcome to it," she said, already turning up the stairs with a candle. "I'll have the boy bring up a fire directly, and something hot, seeing as you've had a wedding night such as this to contend with. God love you both." I watched Miss Hartley open her mouth to correct her, and watched the Duke, with a speed and delicacy I had genuinely never seen him deploy on any question of society, set one hand very lightly on her arm. "Thank you, Mrs. Aldous," he said, "that is most kind." He explained himself to Miss Hartley the moment they had a private word on the landing, in a voice pitched low enough that only I, coming up behind with the bags, properly heard it. "If I correct her," he said, "she will want to know why an unmarried lady is traveling alone with a duke at midnight in a snowstorm, and by morning that question will have traveled faster than we can outrun it on these roads. Let her believe what is easiest for her to believe tonight. We can correct the record in the morning, quietly, with your aunt, in a manner that does not cost you your good name in every parlour between here and Ashcott by breakfast. And what does it cost you, Your Grace, to be thought married to a curate's daughter you met an hour ago?" "Rather less than it costs you to be thought ruined," he said, "which I would have thought was self-evident." He took the floor by the fire in his greatcoat and gave her the bed, and I am reliably informed by Mrs. Aldous, who kept half an ear to that door out of the kind of professional curiosity innkeepers cultivate, that the 2 of them talked until nearly 3 in the morning, not courting talk, not the practiced kind I'd heard him deploy at dinner parties when duty required it of him, but the plain, curious, unguarded kind 2 strangers fall into when they have decided, by unspoken agreement, that nothing said in a snowbound inn at midnight will be held against either of them by daylight. He told her, she told me long afterward, about his father's dying instruction that he never again let himself be publicly compromised the way his own mother had been, 40 years before, by a scheming rival who had engineered precisely this kind of accident for exactly this kind of gain, a false compromise, staged in a garden much like the one Mr. Coates had cornered her in that very evening, that had trapped his father into a loveless match neither parent had ever fully recovered from. It was, she understood at last, the whole of why the county called him guarded, and why he had bolted his carriage door at every posting in for 15 years, and why the sight of a stranger climbing uninvited into his coach ought by rights to have terrified rather than intrigued him. "And yet you did not send me back out into the snow," she said. "No," he agreed. "I find I am considerably more frightened of the kind of man my father's story might have made me, than I am of one snowbound night with an honest woman who climbed into the wrong carriage by accident and told me so herself plainly the moment she realized it. She told him, in turn, about 4 proposals in one season from men who wanted her father's respectable name attached to their disreputable fortunes, and never once asked what she herself wanted attached to anything. "What do you want attached to anything, Miss Hartley?" he asked her, near 2 in the morning by the last of the fire. "Very little," she said, "a small house, work that matters. Someone who asks the question you have just asked me, and actually waits to hear the answer." By morning the storm had blown itself out, and by breakfast half of Ashcott parish had somehow already heard that the Duke of Marchbanks had been seen entering the Plough and Star at midnight with a strange young lady on his arm, because Mrs. Aldous' stable boy had a cousin who worked for the very Mr. Coates whose proposal had started the whole business, and gossip in that county travelled, as the Duke had predicted, considerably faster than any carriage. Miss Hartley, riding back toward Fenning Grange beside him in the pale morning light, said very little, and I gathered from her face that she was already composing in her head the explanation she would owe her aunt. I expected him to correct the record the moment we reached Fenning Grange quietly, as he had promised her on the landing. He did not. He walked Miss Hartley to her aunt's own door himself, in full daylight, in front of the milkman and 2 gardening women and Mr. Edgar Coates, who happened by singularly poor luck to be calling on Mrs. Coates that same morning to press his suit a 5th time, and instead of explaining the misunderstanding of the carriage, the Duke said, in a voice that carried the length of the drive, that he hoped Mrs. Coates would forgive the lateness of a formal call, but that he had spent the better part of the previous night discovering he did not wish to correct any rumor that placed Miss Hartley anywhere near him, and would like, with her aunt's permission, to call properly and often, and for as long as it took Miss Hartley to decide whether a guarded man was worth the trouble of unguarding. Mr. Coates, I am told, left without finishing his tea. You said we would correct the record, Miss Hartley said to him, once her aunt had gone inside in a state of some happy confusion and left the 2 of them alone on the step. I have corrected it, said the Duke. It said this morning that I was a man too guarded to risk his name for anyone. I have amended it. She laughed, really laughed, he told me afterward, for the first time since the carriage door had opened on him in the snow, and said that was, on the whole, a very inconvenient way to propose, to which he replied that he had not strictly proposed anything yet. He had merely amended a rumor, and would she do him the very great honor of allowing him to propose properly once he had learned her favorite flowers and her father's opinion of him. Because he had discovered overnight that he did not intend to do this the fast, convenient way 4 other men that season plainly had. He called at Fenning Grange 3 times that first week alone, and Mrs. Coates, who had spent 2 seasons quietly despairing of ever settling her niece, took to leaving the drawing-room door ajar with an enthusiasm that made Isabel color to the roots of her hair. He learned her father's opinion of him within the week. The old curate's diaries, which Mrs. Coates kept and lent him without being asked, held nothing but kind, unremarkable notes on a distant, dutiful young landowner, which the Duke read twice through slowly, as though searching for something more damning and relieved not to find it. He learned her favorite flowers within the fortnight, from her own careless mention over tea, and had the Marchbanks succession houses forcing sweet peas out of season within the week after that, though he was careful never to say so, and left them instead unsigned on Mrs. Coates's step for a full month before Isabel worked out whose hand they came from. He had not forgotten, either, the 2 questions asked and answered in a snowbound carriage in the dark. Before he ever proposed, he had already written to the parish and set aside the old dower cottage at Marchbanks, empty since his grandmother's day, to be fitted as a schoolroom for the parish girls the moment Isabel wished to open it. No conditions attached and no announcement made, because he told her plainly he had quite enough, that winter, of grand gestures that expected something in return. He had also, in a smaller and more private fashion, begun corresponding with a natural philosopher at Edinburgh about the county's rock strata, a hobby he pursued badly and happily for the rest of his life, and which he credited whenever anyone asked, to a single question asked of him by a stranger in a carriage who had wanted, for once, to know what he might have chosen for himself. He proposed properly on the exact spot in the Ashcot Hall garden where Mr. Coates had once cornered her by the stone urn, his own small correction. He told her to a place that had frightened her and deserved, he thought, a better memory to replace it. They married that October, at Fenning's own small church, with Mrs. Coates weeping happily in the front pew and half the county craning for a look at the bride who had, as the saying quickly went about Ashcot, climbed into the wrong carriage and found precisely the right man. Mrs. Aldous, at the Duke's particular insistence, was sent an invitation and came, and told anyone at the wedding breakfast who would listen that she had known it was a love match the moment she saw them dripping in her hall, wedding night or no wedding night, because no man guards a stranger's reputation with his own name unless he has already decided, somewhere between the crossroads and the fire, that he intends to keep her. The Wren room at the Plough and Star has never since been let to any other traveller on the anniversary of that storm. The Duchess arranged it herself, and Mrs. Aldous, bless her, has never once complained about the lost custom of 1 night a year.